Story number 1.
It was a rainy, cold evening in October when Emma decided to take the back roads through the small town to avoid the heavy traffic. She had been visiting her cousin who lived on the outskirts of town, and the thought of getting home before the rain worsened urged her to hurry. The dark clouds had loomed over the sky all day, and now, with the storm finally hitting, the roads were slick with rain and fog. As she drove, she passed familiar landmarks: the old bakery where she used to stop for sweets as a child, the abandoned church with its tall spires, and then the old farmhouse. It had always intrigued her, even when she was young. A large two-story house with peeling paint and overgrown ivy crawling up its stone walls, the house had been vacant for years. No one seemed to know who owned it, or if anyone ever lived there. Emma had heard rumors, strange things about the house being haunted. She had never believed in such stories, chalking them up to town gossip. But tonight, as the rain beat against her car windows, she couldn't help but glance at it as she drove by. It looked different, though. As she looked closer, Emma swore she saw a faint light flickering in one of the upstairs windows. Her breath caught for a second, but she told herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her. The rain was heavy, and the wind howled through the trees so it could have been anything. Maybe a reflection of a car's headlights or some old light that still worked. Emma shook her head, dismissing the thought, and continued on her way. The town felt especially quiet tonight, like the kind of silence that made her hyper-aware of every little sound. She checked her rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just the misty road behind her. When she finally reached her apartment building, she parked in her usual spot and hurried inside, trying to avoid the rain as best as she could. She made it to her apartment, locked the door behind her, and settled onto her couch with a cup of hot tea. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the warmth of her home helped to settle her nerves. She tried to distract herself with her phone, scrolling through her social media feed, but her mind kept drifting back to the farmhouse. The faint light in the window, the rumors she'd heard as a child, she hadn't thought about them in years. It was probably nothing, she told herself, just a flicker from the storm. Still, there was something unsettling about it. As the hours passed, the storm showed no signs of letting up. She made her way to bed around midnight, the rain beating hard against her windows. The wind howled, rattling the loose window panes. Emma tried to sleep, but the sound of the storm, combined with her thoughts about the farmhouse, made it hard to relax. Then, just as she was drifting off, there came a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to pull her from her thoughts. It sounded like a knock, distant, muffled, and coming from somewhere deep in her apartment. Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up in bed, her ears straining to listen. Another knock, this time louder, more pronounced. She quickly got up and checked the door, but there was no one there. Shaking her head, she muttered to herself about how the storm must be playing tricks on her. Maybe the sound was just the wind or some kind of echo from the building settling. She went back to bed, trying to calm her racing heart. But then the knocking started again. This time it was accompanied by a faint whisper. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She was sure of it now. The sound wasn't coming from outside her apartment. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the building, maybe from the hall or one of the other apartments. Her nerves were on edge, her mind racing with possibilities. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just the old building making noise, the storm pushing the sound through the walls. But the knocking and the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, and now there was a scraping sound, like fingernails running along the walls. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside her door. Emma stood frozen in place, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to check it out, to see if someone was there, but the thought of opening that door was terrifying. Instead, she grabbed her phone and texted her cousin, asking if she had heard anything strange in her building. Her cousin's response came almost instantly. "Emma, don't go near the old farmhouse." The message sent a chill down Emma's spine. She stared at her cousin's words, confused. Before she could reply, a loud crash echoed from somewhere down the hall. Something breaking, the sound reverberating through the walls. It was too much. Emma's heart raced. She could feel the temperature in her apartment drop suddenly, her breath visible in the cold air. That was when the door to her apartment creaked open. Emma didn't move. She could see it, the shadow of something or someone just barely visible in the crack of the door. A figure tall and dark standing in the hallway. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Emma could feel it watching her, staring through the door. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to do something, but her body refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The door slammed shut, the cold air vanished, and the knocking and whispering stopped. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Emma didn't know how long she stood there, trembling, her mind racing. She couldn't explain what had just happened. She had to get out of there, but she was too scared to even move. She grabbed her phone and texted her cousin again. "What do you mean? Don't go near the farmhouse." Her cousin's response came after a long pause. "I told you, Emma. It's not just a house. People who go near it, they never come back the same. You have to leave town. Now." Suddenly, everything clicked. The house, the light, the feeling she had gotten when she passed it earlier, the strange knock, the whispers, the figure in the hall. It wasn't just the storm. It wasn't just her imagination. Something was here. Something that was tied to that house. Emma grabbed her things in a panic and left the apartment without a second thought. She didn't care about the storm anymore. She needed to get away from the building, away from whatever was haunting her. She raced to her car, drove out of the parking lot, and headed straight for the outskirts of town. As she passed the familiar landmarks, the bakery, the old church, she couldn't resist glancing toward the farmhouse. The light was on again in the window. It flickered once more, then went dark. Emma didn't stop. She kept driving, the storm still raging, until she was far enough from the house to feel the tension begin to lift from her chest. She didn't know what had just happened, and she didn't know what was tied to that house, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going anywhere near it again.
Story number 2.
It was late October when James inherited his uncle's old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. His uncle, a reclusive man James barely knew, had passed away suddenly, leaving behind the sprawling property that had been in the family for generations. James had always lived in the city, but with rents skyrocketing and a growing desire to escape the grind, he thought the move might be a blessing in disguise. The house was everything James expected from the photos. A dilapidated, two-story structure with peeling paint, cracked windows, and an air of abandonment. Despite its condition, something about it felt inviting. It was the kind of place that begged for attention and restoration. James arrived in the early evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red. The key to the house was old and rusted, and it took some effort to get the front door open. As he stepped inside, the smell of dust and mildew hit him like a wave. The furniture was still there, covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts in the dim light. Cobwebs draped across the corners, and the wooden floor creaked under his weight. James spent the first hour exploring the house, flashlight in hand. The kitchen was outdated but functional, and the living room had an old stone fireplace that gave the place a certain charm. Upstairs, he found 3 bedrooms, one of which appeared to have been used recently. A narrow staircase led to the attic, but he decided to save that for another day. By the time he finished unpacking his belongings, it was fully dark outside. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees that surrounded the property. James made a quick dinner, ate in silence, and then settled onto the old couch in the living room to read. He barely noticed when the noises started. At first, it was subtle. A faint creak, as if someone had stepped on a loose floorboard upstairs. James dismissed it as the house settling. But then there was another sound, a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped. James froze, his book forgotten. He strained to listen, but the sound didn't repeat. After a few minutes, he chuckled nervously. "It's just an old house," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. He decided to head to bed. The master bedroom was cold, and James found himself shivering as he climbed under the heavy quilt. He left the lamp on, telling himself it was only because he wanted to read a bit before sleeping. As he lay there, the noises returned. This time, they were louder. Footsteps, unmistakable, pacing back and forth in the room above him. The attic. James sat up, his heart pounding. He told himself it had to be an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a stray cat that had somehow found its way inside. Grabbing his flashlight, he reluctantly climbed out of bed and headed toward the attic stairs. The staircase was narrow and steep, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. When he reached the top, he hesitated. The door to the attic was closed, but a faint light seeped through the cracks around its edges. James didn't remember leaving a light on. Summoning his courage, he pushed the door open. The attic was empty. It was a large, dusty space filled with old furniture, boxes, and the odd piece of machinery James couldn't identify. The single bulb overhead flickered weakly. He shone his flashlight around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. As he turned to leave, he heard it again, a whisper. James. He whipped around, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. There was no one there. Hello? He called out, his voice cracking. Silence. James backed out of the attic, shutting the door firmly behind him. He didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, he chalked the incident up to his imagination. Moving into an unfamiliar house, the stress of the past few days, it was enough to make anyone jumpy. Determined to shake off the eerie feeling, he spent the day cleaning and organizing. By late afternoon, the house was starting to feel more like home. James even ventured into town, picking up groceries and chatting with a few locals who seemed friendly enough. When he mentioned the farmhouse, however, their expressions changed. That old place? One man said, shaking his head. You're braver than me, son. James laughed nervously. Why's that? The man exchanged a glance with the cashier. It's just, people say it's haunted. Been that way for years. Haunted? The cashier, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned forward. Your uncle, he wasn't the first to live there alone. Every family that's owned that house has left it eventually. Agresicus. They all said the same thing. There's something in that attic. James tried to laugh it off, but the conversation lingered in his mind as he drove back to the house. That night, the noises started earlier. It was as if the house was alive, creaking and groaning in ways that felt too deliberate to ignore. Once again, he heard footsteps above him. All right, James muttered, grabbing a heavy flashlight and a crowbar. If there's an animal in the attic, I'm dealing with it tonight. He climbed the stairs, his grip on the crowbar tightening. The attic door was slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd closed it the night before. Pushing it open, he stepped inside. The air felt colder here, almost frigid, and the weak bulb overhead barely cast enough light to see. James swept the flashlight beam across the room, his breath visible in the icy air. And then he saw it. In the corner of the attic, a figure stood, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. His face was twisted in an expression of sorrow and rage. James froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Get out, the figure rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. James stumbled back, his flashlight dropping to the floor and rolling away. The figure moved closer, its footsteps silent despite the creaking floorboards. Leave this place, it said, louder this time. James found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Who are you? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed at the far corner of the attic, where an old trunk sat covered in dust. James's legs felt like lead, but something compelled him to move. He approached the trunk, his hands shaking as he knelt and lifted the lid. Inside were papers, photographs, and a worn leather journal. The photos were of James's uncle, but there were others. People he didn't recognize, their faces blurred as if the camera had captured them mid-movement. The journal was filled with his uncle's handwriting, frantic and disjointed. The house is alive, one entry read. It speaks to me. It shows me things I don't want to see. Another entry, the attic, I can't go up there anymore. It knows I'm afraid. James slammed the journal shut, his heart racing. When he turned back to the figure, it was gone. He left the attic that night, locking the door behind him. But the noises didn't stop. The whispers followed him through the house, growing louder, more insistent. He tried to ignore them, but sleep was impossible. By the time dawn broke, James had made his decision. He packed a bag, grabbed the journal, and drove away without looking back. He never returned to the farmhouse. In the weeks that followed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows lingered where they shouldn't, and whispers crept into the edges of his mind. and every so often, in the dead of night, he dreamed of the attic. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The old farmhouse stood at the edge of a forgotten road, its weathered boards groaning under the weight of years. It was one of those places people talked about in hushed tones, a landmark for the superstitious and a dare for the bold. Emily had never believed in ghost stories, but as she pulled her small car up the long gravel driveway one crisp October evening, she felt a chill that didn't come from the brisk autumn air. She had inherited the house from her great-aunt Martha, a relative she'd barely known. The will had come as a surprise, and while Emily didn't need a second home, something about the place intrigued her. Perhaps it was the challenge of bringing it back to life, or maybe it was the deep yearning to know more about her family's mysterious past. Her mother had never spoken of Martha, brushing off questions with vague dismissals, and now Emily had the chance to uncover the secrets herself. The inside of the house was worse than she expected. Dust blanketed every surface, and the air smelled stale and earthy, like something ancient. The furniture was still in place, draped in faded sheets, as though Martha had simply walked away one day and never returned. Emily wandered from room to room, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The house seemed to breathe, its old bones creaking and sighing as if resentful of her intrusion. She decided to stay the night. It was too late to drive back to the city, and besides, she wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't afraid of an old house and a few ghost stories. She made a quick meal from the supplies she'd brought, and then settled into the parlor with a book she'd found on one of the dusty shelves. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was almost cozy. The first sound came just as she was dozing off, a soft, rhythmic thumping like footsteps on the floor above her. Emily froze, her heart racing. She listened for several minutes, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. She told herself it was probably the wind or an old pipe knocking in the walls. Still, she locked the door to the parlor before crawling onto the sagging couch to sleep. In the middle of the night, she woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. Emily sat up, her breath catching in her throat. The room was dark except for the dying embers of the fire. She strained her ears, trying to make sense of the murmurs, but the words eluded her. Gathering her courage, she grabbed the flashlight from her bag and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavier, colder. She followed the sound, which seemed to drift like smoke, leading her to the staircase at the back of the house. The steps groaned under her weight as she climbed, the whispering growing louder with each step. By the time she reached the top, she could make out words, fragments of sentences spoken in a voice that sounded both familiar and alien. "Why did you leave? Come back. Help me." The whispers seemed to come from the end of the hall, where a single door stood slightly ajar. Emily hesitated, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. Inside, moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the room. It was a bedroom, untouched by time. The bed was neatly made, and a small vanity sat against the wall, its mirror reflecting the pale light. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing by the window. It was a woman, her back turned to Emily, her long hair flowing down her back in dark waves. Emily's voice caught in her throat as she tried to speak, but no sound came out. The woman slowly turned, and Emily felt her blood turn to ice. The face was hollow, the eyes dark pits, yet somehow it bore an uncanny resemblance to her great-aunt Martha. The figure raised a hand, pointing to the vanity. Emily's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move. She approached the vanity, her hands shaking as she opened the small drawer. Inside was an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. When she looked up again, the figure was gone. Back in the parlor, Emily lit every candle she could find, unwilling to sit in the dark. She opened the journal and began to read. It was Martha's diary, filled with entries that started out mundane but quickly became unsettling. Martha wrote of hearing voices, of seeing figures in the corners of her vision. She described feeling watched, even when she was alone. One entry stood out, dated just weeks before Martha's disappearance. "I've made a terrible mistake. I thought I could fix it, but the voices are stronger now. They want something from me and I don't know how to give it to them. I'm afraid to sleep. I'm afraid to leave. The house won't let me go." Emily closed the journal, her hands trembling. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her ears straining for any sound, her eyes darting to every flicker of shadow. When dawn finally broke, she resolved to leave. She packed her bag, stuffed the journal inside, and headed for the door, but the door wouldn't open. The knob refused to turn, no matter how hard she pulled or pushed. The windows were sealed shut, their frames warped with age. Panic set in as she tried every exit, only to find herself trapped. The house groaned around her, the whispers starting again, louder this time, more insistent. "Why did you leave? Come back. Help me." Emily stumbled back into the parlor, her breath coming in short, loud, frantic gasps. She grabbed the journal, flipping through the pages, searching for anything that might help her. Near the back, she found a page where Martha had drawn a crude diagram of the house. In the basement, marked with an X, was the word key. The basement door was stiff, but it opened with a hard shove. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of rot. Emily descended the creaking stairs, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, trunks, and tools, but her eyes were drawn to a spot in the center of the floor where the dirt seemed disturbed. She dropped to her knees and began to dig with her hands, the soil cold and clinging to her skin. After what felt like an eternity, her fingers brushed against something hard. She unearthed a small, ornate box and opened it to find a rusted key inside. As soon as she held it, the whispers stopped. Back upstairs, the key fit perfectly into the front door. Emily stepped outside, the crisp morning air filling her lungs. She didn't look back as she got into her car and drove away, leaving the farmhouse behind. But the story didn't end there. Back in her city apartment, Emily placed the journal on her desk, unable to resist the urge to read more. As she turned the pages, a faint whisper drifted through the room. She froze, her heart pounding, as the voice she had heard in the farmhouse filled her ears once more. "Why did you leave? Come back. Help me." Story the end.
Story number 4.
The cabin sat alone at the edge of a dense forest, a forgotten relic of my family's past. It had been abandoned for decades, a summer retreat left to decay after my grandfather died unexpectedly. No one in the family ever went back. My mother refused to talk about it, and as a child, I learned not to ask. But when the cabin was left to me in the will, curiosity outweighed caution. I arrived in late October. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The cabin was exactly as I imagined it. Weathered wood, sagging roof, and windows that seemed to stare back like hollow eyes. I was here to decide what to do with the property, sell it, restore it, or leave it to the elements. But a part of me felt drawn to it, like it held answers to questions I didn't know I had. The inside was eerily preserved, as if someone had left in a hurry. Furniture was covered in white sheets, and a layer of dust muted the colors of the faded wallpaper. A black and white photograph of my grandparents hung crookedly on the wall, their expressions strangely somber. The place smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic like rust. I spent the first day cleaning and taking inventory. The cabin wasn't large, a living area with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The second bedroom had belonged to my mother as a child. Her old toys were still there, a wooden rocking horse, a stack of yellowed books, and a doll with a cracked porcelain face that I couldn't bring myself to touch. That night, as I settled onto the couch with a book, I began to hear faint sounds. It started as soft tapping, like branches against a window, but there were no trees close enough. Then came the creaking, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone was walking slowly down the hall. I told myself it was the old cabin settling, but the unease crept in, gnawing at the edge of my mind. At around midnight, the tapping grew louder. It was coming from the far wall of the living room near the fireplace. I shone my flashlight but saw nothing unusual. The tapping stopped, only to be replaced by the sound of a faint, raspy whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it seemed to come from behind the wall itself. I hardly slept. By morning, the whispers had stopped, but the air in the cabin felt different, heavier, oppressive. I explored the property, hoping to distract myself. The forest was dense, the towering trees casting long shadows even in daylight. About 50 yards from the cabin, I found an old well, its wooden cover rotted and broken. The stone rim was covered in moss, and when I peered inside, I couldn't see the bottom. Something about the well felt wrong, as if the air around it was colder. I backed away and returned to the cabin, deciding to put the discovery out of my mind. That evening, the noises returned. This time, they were louder, footsteps creaking on the wooden floor, whispers coming from every direction. The doll in my mother's room, which I had left sitting upright on a chair, was now lying on the floor, its glassy eyes staring up at the ceiling. I told myself I must have bumped it earlier and put it back on the chair, but my hands trembled as I did so. As I sat in the living room, the tapping returned, more insistent. This time I followed it. It led me to the fireplace. The sound was coming from behind the bricks. I ran my hands over the stone, feeling for anything unusual, and one of the bricks shifted slightly under my touch. It was loose. Pulling it free, I uncovered a small, dark cavity. Inside was a bundle wrapped in cloth. My heart raced as I unwrapped it to find a faded journal bound with string and a tarnished silver locket. The journal's cover was brittle, and when I opened it, the first page bore my grandfather's name, dated July 1956. The entries started out mundane, detailing repairs to the cabin and fishing trips. But as I read further, the tone changed. My grandfather wrote of strange occurrences, hearing whispers in the forest, finding scratches on the windows, and waking up to the sound of footsteps. One entry stopped me cold. Eleanor says she hears them too. She thinks it's the wind, but I'm not so sure. Last night, I found her standing by the well, staring into it. She didn't respond when I called her name. I had to shake her to bring her back. My grandmother's name was Eleanor. The entries grew more erratic. My grandfather described seeing a shadowy figure in the woods, always just out of reach. He began to hear a voice calling his name, urging him to come closer. The final entry read, "I can't stay here any longer. The well, it's not just a well. I don't know how to explain it, but I've sealed it. God forgive me." The journal ended there. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound set me on edge. The whispers grew louder, circling the cabin like a cold wind. At one point, I thought I heard my name. When dawn finally broke, I made up my mind to leave. Whatever secrets the cabin held weren't mine to uncover. As I packed my bag, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks, the unmistakable creak of the rocking horse in my mother's room. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The rocking horse moved gently back and forth, though no one was there. The doll sat upright on the chair, its cracked face turned slightly, as if watching me. I grabbed my bag and ran to the door, but as I reached for the handle, the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The air grew icy, and the lights flickered. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the room, taller than any human, its form twisting unnaturally. I yanked the door open and fled into the forest, not stopping until I reached my car. I never went back to the cabin. I sold the property to a developer who planned to tear it down, and I didn't ask what they found when they did. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the well. I see my grandmother standing beside it, her face blank, her hand outstretched, beckoning me closer. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The autumn air carried a biting chill as Emma pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and trudged through the narrow trail that cut through blackthorn woods. The leaves crunched under her boots, a sound that echoed louder than it should in the eerie stillness of the forest. She checked her watch, 6:17 p.m. Dusk was settling faster than expected, the light fading into a dim, dusky glow. Emma had grown up hearing the stories of Blackthorn Woods, tales whispered around campfires and during late-night sleepovers. They called it haunted, cursed even. People spoke of voices carried on the wind, shadows that didn't belong to any living being, and the lone, crumbling structure deep within the forest known as Hollow House. Most stayed away, dismissing the legends as superstitions. But tonight, Emma had no choice. Her best friend, Nina, had gone missing the previous evening. Authorities said Nina was likely at a party or with someone she hadn't told Emma about, but Emma knew better. Nina had mentioned Hollow House the last time they spoke, joking about how they should explore it for Halloween. Emma had laughed it off then, but when Nina stopped answering calls and texts, the weight of those words pressed heavily on her chest. Emma didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but the thought of her friend lost or hurt compelled her forward. With the faint light of her phone guiding her, she pressed deeper into the woods, the trail narrowing as the trees closed in around her. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into her bones. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and Emma realized she couldn't hear the usual nighttime sounds. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the wind. It was as if the woods were waiting. Finally, she saw it. Hollow House. It stood crooked and weathered, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Vines snaked up the stone walls, and the front door hung on one rusted hinge. A sense of dread clawed at her chest as she stepped closer, but she forced herself to move forward. Nina might be inside. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with the scent of decay. Her flashlight swept across the room, revealing broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and debris scattered across the floor. "Nina?" Emma called, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was only silence. Then faintly, she heard it, a whisper. "Emma." Her heart leapt into her throat. "Nina, is that you?" The whisper came again, barely audible but unmistakably her name. It seemed to come from the far end of the house. Clutching her phone tightly, she followed the sound, her breath hitching with every step. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just saying her name anymore. They were a cacophony of murmured words, too garbled to understand. Emma's flashlight flickered, and she froze. "Not now," she muttered, smacking the phone against her palm. The light steadied, but in that brief moment of darkness, she thought she saw a shadow move at the edge of her vision. "Nina?" she called again, her voice breaking. The whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she entered what must have once been a living room. A fireplace sat crumbling against one wall, and an old mirror hung crookedly above it. The glass was cracked, the shards reflecting her flashlight in broken patterns. Then she saw it. A figure stood in the corner, barely illuminated by her beam of light. It was a woman, her hair matted and her clothes tattered. She faced the wall, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Emma's breath caught. "Nina?" The figure turned slowly, and Emma's blood ran cold. It wasn't Nina. The woman's face was gaunt, her skin gray and mottled. Her eyes were black voids, and her mouth stretched into a twisted grin that didn't belong on any human face. She took a step toward Emma, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Emma stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Stay away," she shouted, her voice cracking. The woman paused, tilting her head as if curious. Then she spoke, her voice a guttural rasp that sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere. "You shouldn't be here." Emma bolted. She turned and ran, her boots slipping on the debris-strewn floor. She didn't care where she was going, as long as it was away from that thing. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing all around her. They weren't just voices. They were accusations, cries, screams. The walls seemed to close in, the house shifting and groaning as if alive. Emma skidded to a stop in a hallway, her chest heaving. She tried to orient herself, to find the door she'd come through, but the house didn't look the same. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. Then she heard it, a familiar voice. "Emma. Help me." It was Nina. Emma turned toward the sound, her fear momentarily replaced by hope. "Nina? Where are you?" "Help me," the voice cried again, coming from behind a door at the end of the hall. Emma didn't hesitate. She rushed to the door and flung it open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. In the center was a chair, and in that chair sat Nina. Her hands were bound, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Emma," Nina sobbed. "Please, get me out of here." Emma rushed forward, her hands fumbling with the ropes. "It's okay, I've got you," she said, her voice trembling. But as she worked, a chill crept up her spine. "Something was wrong." "Nina," she whispered. "How did you get here?" Nina didn't answer. Emma froze. Slowly, she looked up and met Nina's eyes. They were black voids. Nina's lips twisted into the same grotesque grin as the woman's. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed. Emma screamed as Nina's body collapsed into ash, scattering across the floor. The whispers swelled into a deafening roar, and the room began to spin. She stumbled back, her head pounding, her vision blurring. The house seemed to pulse around her, the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath her feet. She had to get out. Blindly, she ran, crashing through doorways and down hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frenzied. Finally, she saw it, the front door. She threw herself at it, her hands clawing at the wood. It wouldn't budge. "Please," she sobbed, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" Behind her, the whispers stopped. She turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. The woman was there, standing in the center of the room. Behind her were dozens of shadows, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They stared at Emma with hollow eyes, their presence suffocating. The woman smiled. "You're one of us now." Emma screamed as the shadows surged forward, enveloping her in darkness. When she woke, the forest was silent. The sun was rising, its golden light filtering through the trees. Emma sat up, her body aching, her mind a foggy mess. She was outside Hollow House, but the building looked different now, smaller, more decrepit, as if it had been abandoned for decades. She staggered to her feet, her heart pounding. She had to get help, to tell someone what had happened. But as she turned to leave, she caught her reflection in a broken shard of glass on the ground. Her eyes were black. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The house was built in 1903, a grand Victorian nestled deep in the Appalachian woods. It had belonged to my family for generations, but no one had lived there for decades. It stood untouched, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and the forest threatening to swallow it whole. I inherited the property after my grandmother's passing, along with an old key on a leather cord and a note that simply said, "The truth lies within." I arrived on a cool autumn afternoon. The trees were ablaze with fiery reds and oranges, their leaves crunching underfoot as I approached the house. The air smelled damp, like moss and rain-soaked earth. The moment I stepped onto the creaking porch, I felt an inexplicable weight settle on my chest, as though the house itself were watching me. The interior was frozen in time. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped like curtains from the high ceilings. The furniture remained, covered in sheets, and old photographs lined the walls, their frames tarnished with age. Faces of ancestors I had never known stared back at me, their expressions unreadable. There was a heaviness in the air, as though the walls held secrets they weren't ready to share. I decided to stay the night. I told myself it was practical. I'd come too far to leave before exploring. But deep down, I wanted to understand what my grandmother's cryptic note meant. I set up a small camp in the parlor, using a sleeping bag and lantern. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of its aging frame. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. My pulse quickened as I sat up, straining to hear more. The steps seemed to come from the second floor, directly above me. I told myself it was the house settling, but the pattern was too rhythmic, too intentional. Gripping the lantern, I decided to investigate. The staircase was steep and narrow, the wood protesting under my weight. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house were trying to hold me back. The second floor was a long hallway lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, sharp enough to sting my skin. I stood there, frozen, until a faint noise drew my attention. The sound of a child humming. I followed the sound to the last door on the left. It was slightly ajar, revealing a small bedroom. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a single bed sat against the far wall, its quilt neatly tucked. A wooden rocking chair faced the window, its back to me. The humming stopped the moment I entered. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper. The chair creaked, rocking gently, though no one sat in it. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. On the bed was a small stuffed rabbit, its fur matted and one button eye missing. I reached for it, but the moment my fingers touched the fabric, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my lantern shaking, but the room was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I yanked the door open and fled back downstairs. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat in the parlor, clutching the lantern and listening to every creak and groan. Just as dawn began to break, I noticed something strange. One of the photographs on the wall, a portrait of a solemn-faced woman, was tilted. I could have sworn it had been straight before. As I approached to fix it, I saw that the wall behind it wasn't solid wood, but a panel that had been pried loose. Curiosity outweighed my fear. I pulled the panel aside to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A cold draft seeped up from below, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. I hesitated, but the memory of my grandmother's note pushed me forward. I grabbed the lantern and descended. The basement was unlike the rest of the house. The walls were rough stone, damp with moisture, and the floor was packed dirt. The air was suffocating, heavy with the weight of untold years. In the center of the room stood an old trunk, its metal hinges rusted but intact. The key around my neck felt suddenly heavy, as though it were urging me forward. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click, and the lid creaked open. Inside was a collection of items: faded letters tied with ribbon, a child's shoe, and a small silver locket. Beneath them was a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. I opened it to the first page, and my breath caught in my throat. The journal belonged to my great-aunt Clara, a woman no one in my family ever spoke of. The entries began innocently enough, descriptions of daily life, the changing seasons, and her love for the house. But as I read further, the tone grew darker. She wrote of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, whispers in the night, and the feeling of being watched. One entry, dated October 17, 1928, stood out. "The humming is louder now. It comes from her room, though I know she's gone. I've tried to ignore it, but last night I saw her. She was sitting in the rocking chair, holding the rabbit. She looked at me, and her eyes were hollow. I don't know what she wants, but I fear it's too late to save myself." My hands shook as I turned the pages. The final entry was brief. "If you found this, I'm sorry. I tried to keep her here, to bind her to this place, but the house is stronger than me. It always has been. Leave while you can." The lantern flickered, and the room seemed to grow colder. I closed the journal, my pulse racing. As I stood, the shadows in the corners of the basement seemed to shift, pressing closer. I backed toward the stairs, clutching the journal and the locket. The house didn't want me to leave. The whispers began as I reached the top of the stairs, soft at first but growing louder. They were pleading, angry, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock, but the key wouldn't turn. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around me like a storm. "Stay. Don't leave. Help her." The locket in my hand grew warm, almost burning. Desperate, I opened it. Inside was a photograph of a young girl with dark curls, her face solemn. A single word was etched into the metal beneath her picture: Evelyn. The moment I said her name, the whispers stopped. The house fell silent, the air heavy with expectation. The photograph in the locket seemed to blur, the edges dissolving like ink in water. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sadness wash over me, as though it didn't belong to me, but to the house itself. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I don't know how to help you." The door unlocked with a soft click. I stepped outside, the crisp morning air filling my lungs. The house loomed behind me, silent and still. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me go. I never returned to the Victorian. I sold the property to a historical society and left the journal and locket with them, hoping they might find answers I couldn't. But even now, on quiet nights, I sometimes hear the faint sound of a child humming as if Evelyn followed me home. Story the end.